Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning procurement management. Part 1. This lesson covers the various steps to procurement, as well as things to watch out for in your procurement process, preventive steps that you can take to avoid some of these problems, and corrective measures that you can take if you do find yourself in some of these difficult situations. And also, of course, the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of procurement management planning. The Procurement Management Knowledge Area's Planning Process group has just one process in it: Plan Procurement Management. But it has several outputs: the Procurement Management Plan, Make or Buy decisions, independent cost estimates, your procurement strategy, the procurement statement of work, the source selection criteria, and your bid documents. Procurement is a little different than the other knowledge areas because it has some very significant legal obligations and penalties involved when you're talking about procurements and contracts and relationships with other organizations. And because of this legal obligation, you need to be more careful and follow more extensive review in these processes. You as the project manager need to have a really good understanding of procurement, but from an overall perspective. The details will be managed typically by your procurement department or your legal department. And so it's important for you to work with people that are experts in procurement and are aware of all of the details and caveats involved in this knowledge area. There are some significant international differences in culture and enforceability when it comes to contracts. Some cultures see contracts as the rule of law, and others see them more as guidelines or aspirational documents that are secondary to the relationship and to the current needs. In different cultures, the courts will interpret these differently. Some will interpret contracts as the rule of law, as having the final say on what the obligations are between two parties. And in other cultures, the courts will look more toward what the benefit to society is or the community, and may completely remove or invalidate parts of your contract that the court doesn't feel serve the needs of the local society or community. As a project manager, you should not assume that the way contracts and the courts work in your culture are the same as the others that you'll be working with. You need to be proactive about understanding what these differences are, and that includes working closely with experts in procurement and your legal department. Procurement is another area in which the PMBOK guide is not very clear on the order in which the processes or steps should be followed. So here in this lesson, I make an attempt to provide you with a reasonable or typical order in which these process steps would flow. The first would be to ask yourself whether or not you should be outsourcing all or any part of this project. In order to do that, you'll need to prepare a procurement statement of work, and then a high-level estimate to determine what your procurement budget is. You may, this is optional depending on your circumstances and your organization and its guidelines and rules, you may need to advertise this opportunity and identify a short list of qualified sellers before you proceed. Then you'll need to prepare and issue some bid documents, such as an RFI, RFQ, or RFP. You may well need to have one or more bidders conferences, and then the sellers will prepare and submit their proposals. You will then need to conduct technical evaluations of the proposals, perform some cost evaluation of them, and make a decision and select the winning proposal, and then move on to the final step of finalizing your negotiations and signing a contract. Let's take a closer look at these steps. The first is your make or buy decision. In order to decide whether you should be doing this work in-house or outsourcing it, what are some of the resources that you have available to you? First, you should take a look at your project charter, your requirements documentation, your project scope statement if you have it, as well as your work breakdown structure and WBS dictionary. These can provide you details of the scope of work that needs to be done that can help you decide whether this is something you can do in-house or not. Also, take a look at your resource requirements and your resource breakdown structure and ask yourself whether or not you have the resources you need to do this kind of work. And then find out whether or not these resources are available. You'll also want to consider whether or not your organization is well suited for this type of project, whether this is up your alley, if you will. To do this, you should probably consult with some experts, people who have had experience on previous similar projects, who are experts in the industry or area involved in this project, as well as those who are expert in procurement. Then you'll need to ask yourself whether or not there are vendors out there that are willing and able to do this work. In order to determine this, you'll need to do some market research, and you may even need to issue a request for information to find out if there are vendors out there that have the capacity and capability that you need, and if they're willing to do it. Once you decide that you probably need to outsource some of this project, you need to ask yourself how much you're going to outsource and how much you're going to do in-house. In order to do this, you can look to the work breakdown structure, as well as other details that you can find in the WBS dictionary, your project scope statement, your requirements documentation, and even your activity list if you have it. Then you take a look at this work breakdown structure and all of these details and determine whether or not there are whole deliverables that you'd like to outsource, or if you want to break this down to individual work packages that need to be outsourced. Or perhaps it's not by deliverable or work package, but more a matter of missing resources that you need to add to your project. Or perhaps certain specific types of activities that you need help on. All of this information needs to be considered so that you can come up with a detailed, unambiguous procurement statement of work. The next thing you should probably do is to come up with a budget for how much you're willing to spend on this outsourcing effort, for this procurement statement of work. In order to do that, you may need to seek out some independent estimates of both your cost and schedule by consulting with some experts, either within your organization or outside your organization. Then you can work on your development approach. For this portion that you want to outsource, is it a better fit to use a predictive approach or something along the spectrum more toward adaptive or agile based on how much unpredictability or uncertainty you have in this work? Then consider the delivery method, whether this is more of a design-build sort of approach, or whether you would like to find someone who can do something more like a design-build-operate. And there are many different delivery methods to consider, and you should consult with your procurement department and experts to explore these different options. You also need to decide on your contract type. Based on the type of work that needs to be done, the risks involved, and the uncertainties, you'll need to pick the best contract type that best matches this work, whether it's a fixed type sort of contract, or one of the cost plus types of contracts, or time and materials. If you haven't already issued one, this is a point in the process in which you might want to issue a request for information, either because you don't yet have enough information to put together an RFQ or RFP, or you may be interested in doing closed bidding, in which you want to narrow the list of vendors who are bidding on the work, and an RFI can help you to do that. Next, you'll usually put together either a request for quote or a request for proposal. A request for quote is more for goods and services that are very well defined and are more commodities. A request for proposal is best for more complex projects involving new development or more uncertainty, and a request for proposal needs to include all of the detail that's needed for the potential vendors to bid on this work. It should include things such as the scope of work, any milestones that need to be imposed, the format that the response from the vendors needs to follow, the procurement steps that will be followed. This should be made available as part of the request so that bidders know what to expect. And for those same reasons, the selection criteria and procurement strategy and contract type should typically be all determined up front and included in the request for proposal. The next step is to solicit bids. Your organization may already have pre-approved lists of vendors that you need to use. Depending on whether your organization is a private or public organization, will also determine how you solicit bids, such as whether you do open or closed bidding, and whether or not you require bidder conferences. When it comes to bidder conferences, the key is fairness. You need to make sure that in this process in which bidders can submit and ask questions and get answers from you, that all bidders have equal access and visibility, and that they have equal participation when it comes to asking these questions and getting these answers. A bidders conference can be handled just as any other meeting in the sense that you could have everyone all gather together into one room, or you could have some people that are remote and you have some remote communications technology in place to involve them real time. Or there may be times where, because of different time zones and other factors, that some people can't be in attendance either face-to-face or remotely in the moment. And so you'll need to record what happens in the meeting, give them an opportunity to be able to review everything that happened in the meeting and have equal access that way. In addition, often a bidder conference will include some upfront questions that are submitted ahead of time. That way those questions can be distributed amongst all of the bidders prior to the conference or at the beginning of the conference. And that gives you an opportunity to make sure you have answers to all of those questions before you start the conference. However, it's important to make sure that anytime any questions come up and you answer them, that everybody gets an opportunity to hear those questions and answers. If your process allows for people to email in questions later after the bidder conference, then you need to make sure that you distribute the question and answer to everyone. Then when you receive the bids, you need to evaluate them using some predefined source selection criteria. Here is a list of some of the possibilities. In some cases, you may be required to go with the least cost or low bidder. This is really only suitable when you have very well-defined quality requirements. Or your source selection criteria could be based only on qualifications, and this is usually only suitable for purchases that are of reasonably low value. One popular option is to go with the highest technical score and then negotiate the terms after that. In this process, it's a multi-phase analysis or evaluation of the criteria, and you pick the vendor that has the best technical score and then sit down and negotiate with them. And as long as you can come to terms, then you go with that vendor. In a quality plus cost approach, you put a little bit more emphasis on the quality than on the cost, and this is suitable for projects that have a lot of uncertainty. Then you have sole source, and that's when you pick someone and ask them for a bid. So there's no competition involved, and because this can be so easily abused, this needs to be justified, and it needs to be the exception rather than the rule. And your organization will probably have some very specific guidelines and limits on when you can use a sole source approach. Another approach is to use a fixed budget in which you publish in the RFP what your budget is, and then based on the procurement statement of work, you have bidders look at that scope and adapt either the scope or the quality or the schedule or more in order to meet that budget. In order to do this, you need a very well-defined statement of work. Finally, we have contract negotiation. This is when you finalize the contract and its terms. You could finalize minor things such as the start date or any currency adjustments depending on the different currencies involved in the final selection. But make sure that any changes are relatively minor and that those changes are consistent with the type of selection criteria, development approach, and contract types, and so on. For example, if you're using a fixed price contract, then that has a very fixed scope and quality that you shouldn't be adjusting very much. The bottom line is you should ask yourself whether or not other bidders could justifiably complain about the changes that you've made during this final negotiation of the contract, whether they would justifiably feel that someone else was given an unfair advantage by being able to make certain last-minute changes. Fortunately, your organization will likely have its own policies and rules around procurement and contract negotiation that follows all of the appropriate laws and regulations and has been put together by experts in procurement and from your legal counsel. On the other hand, if you don't have the advantage of having all of these rules and policies in place for you, then you need to make sure that you do have the proper guidance and authority that you need from your project sponsor and your organization, especially the authority to negotiate and sign for the company that you're working for. For example, you might be working as a contractor hired by another small organization to do some work, and they may not have a full-fledged procurement department. Or you may be working with a smaller company or startup that doesn't have a procurement department. Whatever the reason, if you don't have all of this in place, then you do need to be more aware of all of these needs, and you'll need to be proactive about putting together a lot of these processes and standards yourself. This is the end of part 1. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.